Hello and welcome. I'm Dr. Adam Dorsey, a psychologist in Silicon Valley and the host of Super Psyched, a podcast dedicated to supercharging your life. Each episode contains fun, high-quality interviews with experts looking at psychology from all angles. Super Psyched is your tool to get more of what you want in your life and less of what you don't.
Anti-Jewish sentiment might be the world's longest hatred. Historical documents suggest Jews have experienced this hatred for over 2,000 years, well before the Common Era even began. It would continue through various eras, including the Roman era, the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. And it continues today. Hate crimes against Jews have gone up by 400% in the US compared to last year. So many questions arise, including the obvious. Why are Jews so hated, and what can we do to help? Jewish hatred confuses me deeply. Jews are a people who comprise about 0.2% of the world's population, yet they have been at the forefront of major social justice movements and scientific breakthroughs. Jews show up consistently to lend a hand in repairing the world in disproportionately high numbers, considering they comprise only a fraction of a percent of the population. In this episode, you'll hear two Jewish psychologists discussing anti-Jewish sentiment, misunderstandings that lead to anti-Semitism, and myths and truths. It is my hope that people can walk away with a better understanding of why this is a misplaced hatred. And of course, we discuss what we can do to support Jewish people. My colleague, Dr. Liya Levanda, is a psychologist and educator who specializes in teaching others about Jewish issues like anti-Semitism. As you'll hear, she's thoughtful and very well informed. So listen in as Liya talks with me about supporting Jews through anti-Semitism. Dr. Liya Levanda, a hearty welcome to Super Psyched.
Thanks so much. I'm so excited to be here.
When I heard about you, actually through Dr. Zuhr's work and your attempts to provide psychoeducation to therapists about anti-Semitic issues in the context of psychotherapy, I thought, she's the one I wanted to speak with. I just loved the way you thought. And for this really critical issue at this time, it's an honor to get to speak with you about this very sensitive topic.
The feeling is mutual. I am so grateful when people recognize the importance of these conversations and the importance of cultivating social justice that's truly inclusive of every minoritized group. So I always feel very grateful to share space with people like you, Adam. So thank you.
Right on, Liya. So Jews are actually overrepresented based relative to the population of Jews, which is very low. Worldwide, it is a fraction of a percent of the world's population. And yet, so often you see Jewish people leading the charge for social justice. And yet, it seems that when the tables are turned and it's time to support the Jews, there's not a lot of representation from the other side. And I find myself wondering, I've thought about it a lot. I've discussed it a lot with a lot of smart people. Why is it that the world's longest hatred is hatred of the Jews?
I mean, well, to start with, we're the oldest monotheistic Abrahamic religion, right? We outlive many other groups, Christianity, Islam. But your question, I think we can go about in several different ways. The first is that Jews are very drawn to social justice because there is a component of Judaism, as you may know, called Tikkun Olam, which speaks to this idea of repairing the world. And so for that reason, a lot of Jews, a lot of synagogues, a lot of Jewish movements feel very drawn to nonprofit work, to social justice work. And it's not necessarily something that I think Jews expect to be transactional. Jews don't do it in the sense of, well, I'm doing it for you, so you'll do it for me. It's our way of making the world a better place. Now, when it comes to why this isn't reciprocated, first of all, because it's one of the world's oldest hatreds, it has also learned to evolve with the society around it. For my trainings, I actually had the privilege of sitting down with Mr. Vlad Chaikin, who is the National Director of Anti-Semitism Programming with the Anti-Defamation League, or the ADL. And I use this quote that he gave me all the time. He said, "Anti-Semitism dresses for the occasion." So it's really easy to spot anti-Semitism if it shows up in cargo shorts to a black tie occasion. But anti-Semitism is a lot smarter than that. It knows how to shift dress code. And so that means it can be very chameleonic and it can be very hard to identify. Don't get me wrong, I'm not naive in believing that nobody means to be anti-Semitic, but I do think that a lot of anti-Semitism, especially what we're seeing right now at the time of this recording, I do think a lot of it is unintentional.
You use the word chameleonic, which I've never heard, but I infer it to mean that it's chameleon-like.
Yeah, I got that from Vlad as well.
Which makes a lot of sense in that it's very, very, very well hidden. To your point, I heard from another thought leader in Judaism that if you want to start a large movement, start with hating Jews.
Mm-hmm.
It can be easily whitewashed. People don't notice it. And yet it seems to no era, no geography. It's just really, really popular. And I find it so ironic that here, embedded in the religion, embedded in the culture, is what you just mentioned, which is tikkun olam, which means to repair the brokenness of the world. And it's not meant to be quid pro quo, as you said. It's not. There's no expectation of it to be returned, and yet it's so easy to foment a movement. And I don't really, as much as I've heard on this topic, I just simply don't get it. Why Jews are so hated and why it's so popular. I mean, even Bruno, I don't know if you've seen Sacha Baron Cohen pay, is anti-Semitism, it's really hot right now. So like Sacha Baron Cohen, a Jew himself, is making fun of this. And yet behind this joke is a just sour, bitter truth. I still just don't get it. So if you could kindly give me a little more about the why before we get into what to do.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a $1 million question, isn't it? I think about the way that anti-Semitism has evolved over time. Have you ever seen the documentary by, I forget his name, but he's a well-known Emmy Award-winning director, Andrew Goldberg, maybe? He published a documentary a couple of years ago titled Antisemitism, something Viral Informed Mutation or something like that. Really, really great watch. I really recommend it. He interviews a lot of people, and this, I think, helped something click for me. He interviewed a former white supremacist, and the white supremacist was explaining how he was taught as a white supremacist to recruit people to white supremacy. And the main strategy that they used was they would figure out what was wrong in a person's life, and they would find a way to blame it on the Jews. Quite literally, that was their number one recruitment strategy.
Wow.
And I don't think this is something unique. I think if you look back in history, whatever was wrong in society, people would find a way to blame it on the Jews. Jews were known for being the scapegoats, right? If we think way, way back, it was any kind of famine or financial struggle because Jews happened to be successful. And mind you, the reason why Jews were often in positions around money is because Christians, the dominant religion at the time, were barred from holding positions around money. So the Jews were given what was viewed as the secondary, the lesser, lower class job.
When you say given, I think they were forced into it. Would that be more accurate?
I think so, yeah.
That's my understanding of how Shylock became that character in Merchant of Venice.
Exactly. I mean, speaking of Shylock, examples of sort of anti-Semitic caricatures like that character were created to be very intentional, derogatory representations of Jews. However, this has sort of evolved to the point where we've forgotten the original intention, but it's still there. There's a reason, there's like a whole dissection of this that I really like about media and how the villains somehow always have to have these big crooked noses and this thick curly hair and be miserly and greedy, right? That started out as a bastardization, a really harmful caricature of what people viewed the Jews as. Now, when you shift that to more modern day, and by modern, I mean the last 100, 200 years, Jews were the communists, right? We had the whole Red Scare. Jews were the communists, right? Now, Jews are the colonized, right? Whatever is wrong people find a way to shift that to the Jews are the problem. And that's not something new. That's part of why it's the oldest hatred and why it has this ability to evolve. It's almost this reflex, for lack of a better word. Oh, something's wrong. We need something to blame it on. Okay, it's the Jews' fault.
I'm thinking even neurophysiologically, when we have an external sensation, we hear a noise, we need to attribute it to something. And oftentimes it's a false positive. Oh, I just heard a boom. It must be a gun. Oh, that was actually the falling of a broom or something fell off the fridge. And yet it seems like that reflex, it's almost like it's embedded in the programming of many people. Like something's wrong, blame it on the Jews.
Absolutely.
And I find myself wondering, Jews have been referred to, not by themselves, I believe, as the chosen people. And yet I heard one thought leader say, they are not the chosen people, but they chose God, to your point, before everybody else. They were the first of the Abrahamic religions. They chose God. They chose Tikkun Olam. They are at the forefront, and therefore they are visible when they are leading in science or in the arts or in social justice and politics, even though I've not seen a single Jew rise to be head of state. Maybe in England, I'm forgetting. I think there have been a couple heads of state who've been Jews, but very few have actually risen to the very top relative to the achievements.
Well, the anti-Semitic conspiracy theorists will have you believe that those are just the front men. The Jews are the ones behind the scenes because the Jews control the government. That's
okay. Let's get into that one. I was watching Tokyo Vice. It's a great show on HBO, and you see Jake Edelstein, who is a young reporter for the Yomiuri Daily, the biggest newspaper in all of Japan. One of the people interviewing him said, "You're Jewish. Don't you control the world?" And he said, "If I controlled the world, do you think I would be applying for a job?"
Oh my gosh, exactly. That's what I was come back to. Like if we control the media, don't you think we would have like not as much bias about us in the media, like negative bias? If we control the government, don't you think we would have done something about all the anti-Semitism? If we control the weather, don't you think we would have made it a lot sunnier? Like
that is really a great point. And yet there are also self-hating Jews who are highly vocal as well. Let's talk about that. The self-hatred amongst Jews. It almost feels in some ways like identifying with the oppressor or something else. I know many Jewish people who have just wanted to fit in and maybe even hide their Judaism in these modern times. We're not even talking about Nazi Germany here. Or other places where Jews were obviously marginalized. But the marginalization is so micro that many Jews flip to the other side and begin to bash their own. What's going on here?
That gets really complicated because I think there's a difference between criticism of Israel versus internalized anti-Semitism. Not that there's a whole lot of research out there on Jews' mental health to begin with, but what we do know about internalized anti-Semitism, very much like internalized racism or internalized homophobia, is these overwhelming messages from our environment, right? To get Bronfenbrennerian about it, from all these different levels of our environment, that becomes turned inward. Like a personal example, for those of you who haven't seen me before, I have curly brown hair. And when I was younger, I grew up for part of my life in the Bay Area, and I decided to dye my hair blonde and straighten it. That wasn't a necessarily conscious decision on my part of like, I reject this Jewish aspect of myself. No, it was attempting to fit in with what was perceived as the standard of beauty in my environment and erasing that part of me that is traditionally considered to be a classically Jewish trait. And so those parts of internalized anti-Semitism can be really difficult, especially in times like these, where it's really hard to be a Jew. It's difficult to be proud in the face of such overwhelming anti-Semitism. Jews are having conversations about, do we wear a Star of David? Do we go to synagogue? Do we let other people that we meet know that we're Jewish? And these are really scary conversations to have, especially when you think about how this can impact identity development in young kids, adolescents. The message that they receive is that it's a burden to be a Jew. There's this really wonderful quote by Deborah Lipstadt, who's the US envoy for anti-Semitism. She has this book that I really love. I'm not sponsored. I just really love the book. It's called Antisemitism Here and Now. And again, I'm not going to be able to quote it verbatim, but she writes that anti-Semitism and the internalized anti-Semitism, being Jewish becomes a burden to yourself, to your friends, to your peers. It becomes a negative part of who you are. And that is just really soul crushing.
So true. I'm thinking about my own experience in high school, and people looked at me and they could tell I was different. They couldn't name it. There were very few Jews in my high school. And the question I would get was, I'm not even making this up, multiple times, what are you?
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wanted to look down my pants and just look back up and say, I'm a boy. But, I didn't even know how to field the question. Sometimes things would be said like, oh, don't they cut your dick off when you're 13? These are things I heard. I heard the K word relative to, for those who know what that is, more than a few times. And some people, just to taunt me, would draw up Nazi symbols. And this was back in the 80s when things were relatively good. But the desire to fit in and the feeling of separateness is really, really soul-crushing for anybody who's in that experience. And that's one of the reasons why I've never considered myself to be white.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that's a whole issue. But bottom line, if the KKK or any group would want to kill you, I don't believe that Jews are white for that matter. What is your perception? How have you untangled this difficult issue?
I'm so glad you asked this question. There's a couple avenues that I want to make sure we can explore. And the first is the difference between Jewish ethnic identity and American racial identity. So race, as some of you may know, is a social construct. I believe it was first used, I think in the 1500s. I have this on my slides somewhere. But it was created as a way to be able to categorize people based on the color of their skin. And this is a really important concept to know and be familiar with living in the United States, because America was built on systemic racism. From its core, from the ground up, it was created to benefit people with light skin and to marginalize and oppress people with darker colored skin. And so, knowing that, Americans use definitions that are relevant to them. And the definitions that feel most relevant to them are things like race, ethnicity, nationality. And this is what early movements around multiculturalism and social justice were really focused on. However, this isn't a universal concept. In fact, the United States is one of the most well-known countries that talk about and consider race so heavily, but it's not really a conversation that comes up as often in other countries, right? We talk more about other things like ethnicity in different ways, especially when you think about Jews who are very diasporic, which means they are part of a diaspora. So in around, I think it's the 8th century BCE, the Jews were expelled from their ancestral indigenous homeland, which is what is now referred to as both Israel and Palestine, and resettled around the world. And so what that means is this happened centuries ago. And so Jews have intermingled with where they settled. And that means that Jews come in all colors of the rainbow, right? You have Mizrahi Jews, you have Sephardic Jews, you have Ashkenazi Jews. Mizrahi Jews come from the North Africa area. Sephardic Jews come from the Iberian Peninsula. And then Ashkenazi Jews come from Eastern Central Europe. And so the majority of Jews in the United States are Ashkenazi Jews. Now, this isn't a trend that's replicated around the world. In fact, in Israel, there's actually more Jews of color than there are Ashkenazi Jews. Now, the reason why I think in America Jews are seen as white is because they have lighter skin. A lot of Jews in the United States have lighter skin. The majority of Jews in the United States are Ashkenazi. They come from Eastern Europe. And so, based on the American lens, Jews are seen as white. However, that's not quite representative of how a Jew might identify themselves. Now, it's important to consider that, again, because America was built on racial privilege, Jews who have white skin benefit from that privilege, just as anybody else does. When it comes to situations in which somebody is going to be racist, Jews like me, right? I have light skin, so I'm going to be perceived as white in a situation. I'm going to benefit from that. But that doesn't mean that I am protected from any kind of oppression because I happen to be perceived as white in some situations, right? Quite the opposite. Jews make up only about 2.4% of the US population, and yet they represent more than half of all religion-based hate crimes. So it is very much possible for Jews to experience oppression, to experience discrimination. But I think part of what happens is there's this sort of misunderstanding of, well, if Jews are white because they look white, that must mean they're in the position of privilege. That must mean they don't experience oppression, which leads me to the other component of this idea of Jews and whiteness that I want to talk about, which is the difference between left-wing and right-wing anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm.
Right-wing anti-Semitism says Jews can't be white because we're white and Jews are not better than us. Jews are trying to replace us, right? The whole replacement theory ideology. So right-wing anti-Semitism says Jews are not white. That can't be because we're better than Jews, right? Jews are secondary. Jews are lower class. Right or left-wing anti-Semitism, on the other hand, falls in line with what I was just talking about. Oh, Jews benefit from white privilege. And again, mind you, this is only Jews who have lighter skin. There are millions of Jews around the world in the US who do not have light skin. So left-wing anti-Semitism makes the erroneous assumption that all Jews are white, and then makes the erroneous assumption that because all Jews are white, they're incapable of experiencing oppression. So you have this very interesting juxtaposition. One side says Jews aren't white, and one side says Jews are white. But both of those have very anti-Semitic intents and effects.
And you call it an interesting juxtaposition. I would call it a troubling juxtaposition, if you don't mind, because boy, this is really, really tough getting these two messages. It's almost like what we call in psychology a double bind. To make it sound almost funny, it's like when somebody gives you two ties, a blue and a yellow tie, and you show up in the blue tie and they say, "What? You didn't like the yellow tie?" There is no way to be okay in this scenario, and it's crazy making. It's kind of similar to the other paradox of, being told to sit in the corner in a round room. There's no place to go. One other concept and I want to get into the epigenetics and the anxiety of being Jewish.
Oh, boy.
Because, since in the diaspora, folks, what that means is being outside one's homeland. For those not familiar with the term, is that an okay term? Yeah. And being visitors for millennia, nearly. I asked a rabbi once, I noticed that Jews are not big drinkers, and yet we really care a lot about food. And there's even a Jackie Mason joke about that. You can tell who the Jews are by saying, "Hey, where are we going to eat after this thing?" And the people who aren't Jewish will say, "Hey, let's go grab a drink." And I asked, why is it that Jews are an eating people, not so much a drinking people? And he said, well, the best explanation I have is kind of a sad joke. And that is that you need to have your wits about you in case the Cossacks come and try to run you out of town. But you shouldn't have left home without having eaten a good meal. So it's this kind of bitter joke, and it resonates. And I think about epigenetics. We know from studies on mice that we can put two groups of mice experiencing the smell of a cherry blossom, a very kind of non-offensive scent, and it doesn't disturb mice. And yet one group of mice, upon being in the presence of that cherry blossom, hear an aversive sound. And the offspring of those mice run away from the cherry blossom even several generations later. So there's a basis for epigenetics, the idea that we pass down a host of messages through our genes, including intergenerational trauma can be passed down. So let's talk about that for a moment. What are some of the issues that might be faced by Jews, even those who aren't the descendants of Holocaust survivors, but Jews in general who have been for centuries, if not millennia, in diaspora?
Well, first of all, I do want to just make it known that there has been research with epigenetics and the Holocaust, and that descendants of Holocaust survivors, there are literally differences in their genetic expression, which is absolutely bonkers to think about, but also makes a lot of sense. I think about the world of trauma and trauma research, and even something like The Body Keeps the Score. If you are familiar with that, for you, it'll be like, well, duh, that makes sense. The body keeps the score.
Basically, trauma, according to Bessel van der Kolk, and it's been really supported by all the research, is that it's a body-based experience, and it can manifest in a host of physiological ways.
Yeah. And it's a funny, quote unquote, funny sort of generalization that Jews like to make about themselves is that there's this level of baseline anxiety that Jews have. And I say, quote unquote, funny because that comes from the generational trauma. I think a lot of people, when they think of Jewish generational trauma, think of the Holocaust, and they're correct. That is probably up until October 7th, the most recent generational community trauma that Jews experienced. But there's more than just that. There was the Crusades. There was the destruction of the Second Temple and the subsequent expulsion of the Jews, right? Generational trauma is something that is centuries old for us. And so when you put all that together, these centuries of persecution, these centuries of needing to be on guard, we do get a baseline level of anxiety. I think I was reading something about how there's higher levels of anxiety in Jewish populations and even misdiagnosis of OCD in Jewish patients because Judaism has these very ritualistic expectations, right? To the untrained eye, it can kind of look like OCD. And I think this baseline anxiety, baseline neuroticism evolved from a place of persecution. And when we think about how this impacts Jews today, one thing that I've heard a lot since October 7th, and I have witnessed this both personally and professionally, younger Jews, let's say Jews below the age of 40, were often told by their parents, their grandparents, oh, the world is very dangerous. The world doesn't like Jews. You need to be constantly on guard. Da, 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 da. And these younger Jews would say, oh, my parents, my grandparents, they're just paranoid because of the Holocaust. They lived through that. But the world is different now. I don't need to be so worried about anti-Semitism. And then October 7th happened. And everybody said, oh, my goodness, my parents were right. My grandparents were right. To see the generational trauma being passed down in like live HD in real time is just really something. To see these younger Jews have their parents and their grandparents' warnings be validated of, hey, the world actually hasn't changed as much as you think it has. The world does still hate Jews and the world will still be violent towards Jews is something really profound.
It almost feels like the phenomenon of brine shrimp, which come in a package, you just add water and the brine shrimp start swimming around. And it seems like it's a just add water type of, and I'm using water as obviously not literally, but just add X and there's a revival. And I think there's this awareness. There's another old Jewish joke, and this woman who recently comes from the old country where she was traumatized, moves to the Lower East Side, and her son says, how do you like it? And she says, it's quiet. It's too quiet. And the meaning of that joke is she's waiting for the other shoe to drop. She's waiting because she knows just around the corner something is going to happen.
There are a lot of stories. I even have my own personal family stories of Jews leaving Poland before the Nazis invaded. And the best that they can describe it is it just didn't feel good. It felt like something was going to happen. And those Jews who left Poland before the Nazis took over survived. And those who didn't. My great-grandmother on my mother's side was one of those people. She was the only one in her family to leave. She didn't trust the environment, and she was the only one who survived.
Where did she go?
She went to Israel.
And my mother-in-law the same. Left Germany 3 months before Kristallnacht.
Yeah. And this is where I think it can get tricky with mental health and supporting Jews, because there's this very blurred line of where do we validate that, okay, this is coming from centuries of generational trauma and this is your ancestors, right? This is your lineage, your legacy saying, hey, we need to put our guard up. We need to put our defenses up. Where do we draw the line between that and, okay, maybe we're snowballing, maybe we're catastrophizing, right? Like, how do we engage in some more balanced thinking, right? Like, how do we draw that line?
How do we actually distinguish between real and imagined anxiety?
Exactly.
Because real anxiety can save you, like cause you to leave a place and survive. And the imagined one is like, a pine cone's going to fall on my head and kill me. So that's a really difficult one.
It is, especially when you gave the example of the pine cone falling on the head. And we can kind of laugh because the chances of that are infinitesimally small. But the chances of Jews being hurt are not infinitesimally small anymore. I don't think they ever have been, but the chances feel bigger than ever. I mean, rates of anti-Semitism are at an all-time high. I think the ADL says it's up 400% since October 7th. And it's a very real concern that a lot of Jews have. We have those conversations of, like I mentioned before, do I wear my Star of David? Do I wear my kippah? Do I go to synagogue? Do I express myself as somebody who's Jewish, knowing that the risk that puts me in?
Do I put a mezuzah, which is one of these ornaments, on my door it actually informs the world that Jews live here. I've heard a lot of my own clients say, I have since October 7th removed my mezuzah.
Yeah.
If we have 2.4% of the population of the United States being Jewish, what is the worldwide population? It's way under 1%, 0.2%. So Liya, what can a person who wishes to be an ally to Jews, irrespective of their feelings about Israel, but who cares about social justice and wants to stand by Jews, what can be done?
Excellent question. A lot of people ask me this. They'll say, I support people in Palestine. I support people in Gaza, and I'm upset that they are being killed. But I also want to support Jewish people, right? How do I do both? How do I pick a side? And my answer is there are no sides and you don't need to pick. At the end of the day, these are communities that are both being really hurt. And your support of one over the other is not exclusionary. If anything, I mean, mental health professionals especially, our role is to mitigate harm. And I think that's what a lot of social justice advocates want to do. They want to minimize harm for everybody, any minoritized group. And the groups that we're talking about here are both minoritized and oppressed groups in different ways. And so my response is you don't have to pick. You can identify this thread of common humanity of, hey, I want to minimize human suffering. How do I, in my individual position, do that? And so when it comes to how to support Jews, the first thing that I'm thinking of is you have to know what you're talking about. I think there's so much misinformation and disinformation that's been circling, and that makes it really hard to understand what's real, what's not, what's the history. And I'll say Jews have a kind of an unfair advantage when it comes to learning about the conflict because they have a whole lifetime ahead of non-Jews, right? We don't have a choice in learning about Judaism and learning about the Middle East. That's our life. That's us. And so I don't think that it necessarily takes a lot of effort or a lot of knowledge to be able to support Jews. In fact, there's this really cool research coming out of the ADL that says if you learn about Jews and you learn about anti-Semitism, just that alone makes you less likely to be anti-Semitic. That is so powerful. By doing something as simple as listening to this podcast episode or going to even like Wikipedia or something like that, those little actions of learning make you less likely to perpetuate unintentional anti-Semitism. And that is such a powerful, powerful tool. Think about what else you can do if you say to yourself, I've learned the basics. I want to take it a step further. I want to go deeper. Even something as simple as, oh, I know there's a Jewish holiday coming up and my employee is probably going to want that day off. Simple things like that still happen today. That Jewish holidays come up and employers are like, what do you mean you want a day off? You already get all of our holidays off. Happens more often than you'd think today.
It happened to me back when I was in the corporate arena. Sure.
Absolutely. There's so much you can do just by learning so little. Even by learning about the basics of Judaism, even by learning what are some of the concerns that Jews in your community might have about anti-Semitism, learning about, hey, is anti-Semitism happening in my community? If so, is there anything I can do to support? If you know Jewish people personally, being able to say, hey, like, I know there's a lot going on right now. Is there a way that I can support you? Because one of the most universal things that I've heard in the aftermath of October 7th, and I'm speaking from both my professional and personal spheres, is this sense of complete isolation. Jews feel like they are totally alone. It is them against the rest of the world because the rest of the world is calling for their death, is saying that they don't deserve to exist, all these other things. And so just the simple act of letting a Jewish person that they're not alone can be so, so powerful and so restorative.
Beautifully said. Liya, I could talk with you all day.
Yeah.
And Liya, I would like to ask you my miracle question that I ask virtually all guests. And that is, if you had the magical power to confer upon all humanity one insight or skill that would dramatically improve the lives of the individual and perhaps, since we're all connected, society at large, what would that skill or insight be? And how do you imagine it would improve the lives of the individual as well as society at large?
Oh, gosh, I love that question. Immediately, one thing jumped to my mind, and I feel like a broken record saying it. I'm sure I've already said it multiple times today. I say it all the time in my own trainings and my own speaking engagements. It's that you need to be able to cultivate a social justice advocacy that is truly inclusive of all. And I feel like that's something that is getting lost today, that your social justice should not be excluding other minority groups. There is so much that needs to be done in support of Palestinians, absolutely. But that doesn't mean that you need to oppress Jews in order to make that happen. That doesn't mean that you need to ignore Jews and anti-Semitism in order to make that happen. The one insight that I wish everybody would take away is social justice is inclusive of everybody.
Beautifully stated. And to that point, I would just like to punctuate it with, and the removal of education about the Holocaust from curriculums throughout the state is dangerous. And many children these days do not even know about the Holocaust, let alone the real details of it. So, wow, Liya, I thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, your wisdom, and really, really just articulating it so beautifully so that my listeners can learn from you. I'm grateful also that with all of your studies on psychology that you've decided to dedicate a portion of it to this important topic. So I just can't thank you enough.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been such a lovely experience. And thank you for being one of the people who recognizes how important these conversations are. I started doing this because nobody else was. I didn't see anybody else doing this. And so I thought, okay, if nobody is going to do it, it's going to be me.
Lovely. All right, sister. Thanks again.
Thanks so much, Adam.
This is Dr. Adam Dorsey thanking you for listening to Super Psyched. If you know anyone who might like it or who might benefit from listening, share it. And if you like the episode, please hit subscribe.